Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has made history this week as of Saturday when he surpassed David Ben-Gurion as the longest-serving prime minister in Israeli history. And that's quite an achievement for a prime minister who has had to spend much of his career outmaneuvering and outsmarting his detractors. And so we want to take a look back at his 13 years in office. Despite whatever scandal or crisis is thrown his way, come election time, Netanyahu consistently emerges triumphant. First elected in 1996, Netanyahu became Israel's youngest prime minister at just 47 years old, while he only remained in power for 3 years before being defeated by Ehud Barak. He resumed control of the country in 2009 as rival Tzipi Livni failed to form a ruling coalition at the time. Since then, Netanyahu's enduring legacy and efficacy as a political leader cannot be denied. Under his tenure, settlements in the West Bank have expanded, Israel has developed strong diplomatic ties with countries around the world, he's opened channels of communication with Arab Gulf states, has warned the world and put Iran in check, and has often refrained from using excessive military force against Israel's enemies. He also worked during some of Israel's most monumental events, like the recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital, moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, and the recognition of Israeli sovereignty over parts of the Golan, as well as leading the startup nation to be named one of the top 10 most innovative countries in the world. And yet, despite all these achievements, Netanyahu has also remained a divisive figure in Israel. His critics on the one hand say he's a corrupt fearmonger, focused only on staying in power, while on the other hand, those who support him see him as a protector of the Jewish state, who has kept the country safe, fostered innovation, and cultivated unprecedented diplomatic ties around the world. Either way, the only question that remains then is, can he keep this incredible momentum going past elections in September? Or will King Bibi, as he's known, be dethroned? Christians United for Israel is the largest pro-Israel grassroots organization in the United States, with over 5 million members, uniting Christians to act to defend Israel against BDS, lies, and delegitimization. The organization recently held its annual summit in Washington, D.C., and here to tell us about the work that this organization does, just back from the summit in the U.S., is Rabbi Dov Lipman, former Knesset member and senior manager of community outreach for Honest Reporting. Welcome.
Thank you, Dar. Good to be with you.
So can you tell us some more about this organization and the work that they do?
It's really an incredible development for Israel and also the Jewish people around the world. I went there representing Honest Reporting to talk to the Christian supporters of Israel about how they can learn how to advocate for Israel wherever they may be. And I went to teach, and I'll be honest with you, I walked away so inspired. There were thousands of people at the summit in Washington, D.C., representing 7 million people under the leadership of Pastor John Hagee from Texas, and they believe that Israel belongs to the Jewish people. They believe that they, as Christians, need to support Israel, lobby for Israel, pray for Israel, do whatever they can for Israel's success. And the additional element, which I saw this year, was they also believe they have to fight against anti-Semitism in the United States. So we found true brothers and sisters who are there for Israel whatever we need.
And so you just returned from their summit. What more can you tell us? I mean, who were some of the main speakers? What were some of the main highlights?
Highlights definitely included my interaction with CUFI on campus. They have representatives on 300 campuses in America where they're out there fighting against BDS, fighting against Students for Justice of Palestine, fighting for Israel, helping Jewish students on campuses. The highlight speakers are certainly Vice President Pence was a highlight speaker, there's no doubt. David Friedman, the U.S. ambassador to Israel, was there. Danny Danon, the Israeli ambassador to the United Nations, was there. They're very prominent speakers, a lot of very interesting interviews. But what I really saw was a well-oiled machine. They know what they're doing. They know how to lobby Congress. On the last morning of the summit, they laid out a few pieces of legislation, which every single delegate there then went to Capitol Hill and lobbied their senators and their congressmen about BDS, about fighting against Hezbollah, about fighting anti-Semitism. And they really are not just saying that they support Israel in word, but they're actually doing it in deed. The biggest highlight for me that I'll tell you was the singing of Hatikva, the Israeli national anthem. I've been at many ceremonies, many gatherings, always emotional and moving. People, Christians, singing our national anthem with such emotion and such feeling. It was something which inspired me deeply.
Well, this really is an incredible organization. I mean, what motivates the members to defend Israel? Is this all due to just the religious connection?
It very much is a religious connection. They spoke openly about the Bible, and the Bible saying that God gives the land to the Jewish people. They quote Genesis 12:3 regularly, where God tells Abraham that the nations of the world will be blessed if they bless you, and they see supporting Israel and the Jewish people as a source for their blessing as well. But I have to be honest with you, they're also talking truth. They don't only talk about the Bible, they talk about history, they talk about our historic claims to the land, archaeological evidence that this land belongs to us. They certainly had a whole feature this year about the city of David and all the evidence that's been proven about King David and our connection to the land. So they do have the religious side, but they also are following intellectual honesty and saying we have to fight for truth, not just truth in the God sense, but truth in the historical and archaeological sense as well.
And so in the current climate in the U.S., as you've mentioned, they've worked to combat BDS for quite some time now. But now you've said that they've taken on anti-Semitism as well. Can you talk about their work doing that?
It was really powerful when Pastor Hagee stood up and said, Christians have been responsible for persecuting Jews throughout the world history, and we weren't there, he said, to stop it. But now we're here, he said. And how can we see Jews being persecuted and we're not going to stand up and fight for them? And they worked very hard on legislation that's going to strengthen the penalties for anti-Semitism and the definition of anti-Semitism as well in the United States, and that will lead to budgets spent on fighting anti-Semitism. And they said they will be any place where Jews are being persecuted or attacked. They're going to be there as fellow people of faith to stand there and fight for them. And as a Jew, and there were a number of Jews that were there, it was extremely powerful to hear that, because sometimes in a country which is not our own, so to speak, you can feel alone. And we've seen what's happened in recent months and years to the Jewish people in the United States and the increase in anti-Semitism. And to realize there's an organization, Christians United for Israel, 7 million strong, who are there to fight against the anti-Semitism. It's something which should enable Jews to realize there is hope. There are people that are there to fight with us, and we're not alone. And I think that was very empowering for the Jews who were there and for Jews all around the world who hear about this organization and its efforts.
An incredible organization indeed. Rabbi Dov Lipman, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thank you so much.
Over the past few days, 3 major Democratic presidential candidates, former Vice President Joe Biden, U.S. Senator Cory Booker, and Indiana Mayor Pete Buttigieg, were ambushed by Jewish anti-Israel activists from the organization If Not Now. The activists pressed all 3 candidates to address the Israeli occupation of the Palestinians. Let's take a look.
But Vice President, you have been paying lip service to a 2-state solution for a long time now, while a 1-state reality has been created on the ground. I'm asking, what meaningful pressure will you put on the Israeli government to end the occupation?
Constantly pressuring them in terms of what they can and cannot do relative to what is accepted internationally. We spoke out against their occupation in our administration, but they are an ally. They are an ally. And the fact of the matter is they're entitled to have a Jewish state in the Middle East that's free and secure. They're responding, over-responding to what's happened. But the fact of the matter is, Israel is a necessary, and I think entitled to be, a Jewish state in the region. And until, if you notice, not one single solitary Palestinian has said, I agree that there will be a Jewish state in the region.
Vice President, if you support freedom and dignity for all, I'm asking you what concrete actions you will take to support the freedom and dignity of Palestinians living under occupation right now.
I will tell them to accept the notion that Israel has a right to exist, and I will insist on Israel, which I've done, to stop the occupation of those territories, period.
If Not Now tweeted this exchange and wrote that Biden retreated into AIPAC's anti-Palestinian and false talking points. The activists posed the same question to the other candidates. Booker refused to engage the activists and answer the questions they posed as to whether the occupation is a human rights crisis and a violation of international law. While the activists pressed Booker, he simply said, if that's your issue, I would understand if you wanted to support somebody else. This series of questioning is part of a new campaign launched by the nonprofit group, which took on 6 full-time fellows to bombard and confront candidates about their position on Israel as they begin campaigning in New Hampshire and throughout the primaries campaign. Starling News survey was released this past week, revealing that 1 out of every 5 Americans believe businesses should be allowed to refuse to serve Jews. And joining us with more information is ILTV's Nittany Manson. Nittany, thank you for joining us.
Hi, Lidar. Thanks for having me.
So Nittany, what can you tell us about the survey?
Well, it was conducted by the Public Religion Research Institute, and this is an organization that's main goal is to help the American public better understand the cultural and religious dynamics that make up the American society. So they're constantly keeping an eye on major issues affecting the American people.
Okay, so is this a survey specifically geared towards opinions on Jews in America?
No, the survey actually dealt with many demographics like African Americans, Muslims, LGBTQ communities, and even atheists. So it was not directed specifically at the Jews, but what is so shocking is that things like this are still even an issue in what we like to think of as such a progressive country and time.
Well, I mean, the last few years have seen a noticeable rise, not only in anti-Semitic incidents, but also race and gender-related hate and rhetoric.
Exactly. And with this survey released on Tuesday, we get a glimpse into people's perspectives relating to these groups.
Okay, so what exactly were the results that were concluded from this?
Well, the survey was broken down by gender, political party, and religion, showing us that the percentage of Americans who believe that small businesses should be able to refuse service to Jews has risen 7 points from 2014, going from 12% to 19%. And even more than that, Republicans came in at 24% compared to the Democratic percentage of 17%. And this is especially scary, seeing that these numbers are really rising. Back in 2014, the Republican percentage was at 16% and Democrats were only at 9%. So this slow increase is really something to be concerned about.
Well, that really is concerning, and also very interesting statistics with regards to the political parties and the views of their supporters. But you also mentioned religious groups. Was there any kind of difference there?
Well, support for the refusal to serve Jewish customers has increased there also, with white evangelical Protestants up 24% from 12%, white mainline Protestants up 26% from 11%, and Catholics actually doubling from 10 to 20%. The group that stayed more or less consistent was non-white Protestants that only went up to 19 from 14%. And again, these statistics are coming from 2014 to 2019.
Okay, so these numbers are still quite disturbing, but I have to say not entirely surprising given the climate that we see today with regards to anti-Semitism.
Yes, however, we do need to keep in mind that this survey was only based on a pool of 1,100 people, and they did actually admit to oversampling in certain areas. So we need to take it with a grain of salt and remember that this is not a representation of the widespread belief of American people. However, it is something that needs to be paid attention to.
Well, let's hope that the right people are looking into this and that we can see a change in the coming years. No one should be refused service anywhere based on anything like religion. Well, Nittany, thank you so much for taking the time to come and speak with us today.
My pleasure.
This past week, some 240 Israeli Jewish academics signed a petition against calling BDS anti-Semitic. The academics called on the German government to reject the recent Bundestag resolution that declared BDS as anti-Semitic, saying that it is a legitimate and non-violent means of resistance. The academics went even further and called on Germany to continue to directly and indirectly fund organizations involved in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This controversial stance on BDS is not new in Israeli academia, and neither is the issue of foreign funding of Israeli NGOs, something that the Israeli government is trying to combat. And here to discuss these issues and more is Eitan Meir from Im Tirtzu, an organization whose mission is to combat BDS in Israel. Eitan, let's jump right in. So BDS from within Israel, it's not something we often think about, but how common of a phenomenon is it?
It's unfortunately very common, but before delving into it, I just want to give really the viewer understanding of what it really means. Now, the international BDS phenomenon doesn't happen in a vacuum. The average Joe that lives in Sydney, New York, or London doesn't wake up one morning and say, I want to go ahead and boycott Israel. What happens is that they get their information from somewhere, they get encouragement, they get their inspiration, and that's from Israeli academics or members of Israeli NGOs that go ahead and write, let's say, articles in The Guardian, in the New York Times that call Israel an apartheid state, that accuse it of ethnic cleansing, of being doing war crimes. And then they go ahead and do international petitions. They sign international petitions like this, promoting BDS, promoting international pressure. And then the person goes ahead, your average Joe goes ahead and sees it and says, wait a second, these are Israelis that are saying it. BDS, it must be good. Israel must really be an evil country. And you really were able to see it in a lot of different examples. Just earlier this year, you had a professor in Hebrew University, a senior professor in the Faculty of Law, who gave a lecture in Columbia University in New York, who said that Israel does weapon experiments on Palestinian Arab children and actually murders Palestinian Arab children in order to go ahead and market their weapons as battle tested. Last month, you had another professor in Hebrew University, an international program which teaches international students, Laura Al-Qassem, which was a big controversy recently.
Right.
She was one of the students there, and she was exposed, really going ahead and promoting obscene anti-Israel rhetoric. Among them, bringing a professor who accused Israel of being a fascist state. Another speaker accused Israel of torturing Palestinian Arab children. Another tour that she organized was with a tour guide who promoted BDS. And even last week, I'm sorry that I'm going on, but there's just so many examples. Last week, you have another professor, again at Hebrew University, who signed an open letter calling on the world to go ahead and boycott an international physics Olympiad that's going to be held next month in Tel Aviv. So when we're talking about the BDS phenomenon and combating BDS, we have to understand that what's spearheading it are Israelis, are Israeli academics, are members of Israeli NGOs. So in order to go ahead and combat it, in order to go ahead and really solve the problem, we have to solve it here, because what's happening abroad is a symptom of the problem. And that's exactly what Internetsu does.
So are you saying that these academics, these Israeli NGOs, are granting legitimacy to BDS, or they're the ones actually pushing BDS out into the world?
They're the one pushing it. It starts from Israel. There's a saying, what happens in Vegas doesn't stay in Vegas. So what happens in Israel doesn't stay in Israel. It's exactly because what gives legitimacy, it's also legitimacy, and that they push it, because when, again, you have a professor in, in Berkeley, and he doesn't really know, he hasn't been to Israel, but when he hears his colleague in Hebrew University, Tel Aviv University, go ahead and reaffirm his beliefs that Israel is an apartheid state, they do war crimes, etc., then he goes ahead and gets bolstered by it, and he says, wait a second, it's really true, I'm going to go ahead and push it. And what's really bad is when you think about it, is that these professors are funded by the Israeli taxpayer, you and I, because Israeli institutions, the vast majority of them, are heavily subsidized by the Israeli government. So it's not only that these professors are going ahead and promoting BDS, they're doing it at our expense. And what's absurd is that they don't go ahead and use when they sign the petition, when there are 240 professors, when the Israeli ones that signed the petition, they didn't write Dr. X. They wrote Dr. X from the University of so-and-so. And so think about it, you have a Zionist, an amazing guy that lives in New York, he's a philanthropist, he donated a wing in the university, and he has a position named after him, the Mr. Greenberg Chair of Law. So what happens now is that this professor is going ahead and signing this BDS petition, and his name appears as the Professor X, the Greenberg Chair of Law. So this guy in New York, this amazing guy, this Zionist who donates money to Hebrew University, Tel Aviv University, Ben Gurion University, Haifa University, thinks he's doing an amazing thing, and he is, but he's getting taken advantage of by these professors who are not only spitting in his face, they're spitting in the face of the taxpayer and the state of Israel.
And you've singled out the Hebrew University, but is this something that's actually going on across all Israeli universities?
Yeah, in the letter that we're talking about, you have 24 signatories from Hebrew University, 24 from Tel Aviv, 11 from Ben Gurion University in the Negev, 9 from Haifa, 5 from the Weizmann Institute, 5 from the Open University, another couple from Bar Ilan. It's really a widespread phenomenon.
And so you've mentioned this isn't the first time that Israeli academics have signed a petition or called for a boycott. And it's a little ironic because they're academics living in Israel, working in Israel, and in some instances they're actually calling for a boycott of their own institution. I mean, what's your take on this?
I mean, that's exactly what they're doing. And the sad thing is that the university heads are just not doing anything. The university heads want to sweep it under the rug, and I understand them. It's hard to deal with. It's hard to go ahead and get there and deal with the problem. But they view the university professors, especially the ones that have tenure, as some sort of sacred cow. They can't touch them. But even though it's
well, they use the argument of academic freedom.
Exactly, but it's not academic. Academic freedom is the idea for you to be in a class and say, okay, I'm going to go ahead and say what I want. I'm going to say point A and point B, and then the students go ahead and choose. Academic freedom isn't to go ahead and spew whatever kind of hatred you want. For example, if you have an academic in the class that started spewing anti-Semitic or racial slurs, is that academic freedom? Of course not. It's just bigotry. So the same thing here is that there has to be a red line. And as we see it, BDS is exactly that red line. When you have a professor who's funded by the Israeli taxpayer and he's calling to boycott this very institution that's giving him money, that's a red line.
And I want to touch upon the other issue that was raised, and that's foreign funding of Israeli NGOs who are dealing with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Can you expand on this and explain?
So there really is a vast network of radical anti-Israel NGOs that go ahead and try to delegitimize every single part of the country. I don't want to really get into it, but in the Negev they say ethnic cleansing, in the Judea and Samaria obviously apartheid and occupied, Jerusalem segregation, and they go on and on. And they get money from foreign governments and the New Israel Fund because they in Israel have no legitimacy. They have a very, very small percentage of the Israeli public that actually cares and wants to listen to what they have to say. So they can't get funds from Israel, from people within Israel, so they seek foreign governments and the New Israel Fund to go ahead and try to influence the policy of the country through the back door. So we view this as highly undemocratic. And if you look at, let's say, the Supreme Court, you have organizations, let's say, Hamoked, the Center for the Defense of the Individual, ACRI, Adala, these are all names of anti-Israel organizations, and they go ahead and defend terrorists in the Supreme Court. They actually defend terrorists who have Jewish blood or Israeli blood on their hands in the Supreme Court. So essentially what you have is that, let's say the government of Germany or Sweden or Norway, they're funding the legal defense through the back door of terrorists who murdered Israelis. It's unbelievable.
And how are you combating this?
So there's kind of two ways. The first step is exposure, because people have to know about this. And if you look 10 years ago, no one had any idea this was going on. We've had several large campaigns that really raise public awareness.
Right.
The second thing is really working with decision makers and also helping them understand the problem that they could act. There's been several laws that have been passed that Institute has been an inspiration for the laws, whether we go back to 2015, the transparency law, or 2 years ago there was a law passed that's saying you can't get positions in national service if you get the vast majority of your funding from foreign governments. So because before you had someone from B'Tselem, a radical organization, who accuses Israel of war crimes and tries to promote its international pressure, you had the public funding a national service position in their organization. So at the same time, you have a guy at B'Tselem accusing someone else who's serving the country of war crimes, and he's getting paid for it. So after we had a big report about it and it was exposed, and then the decision makers say this is insane, we have to go ahead and enact legislation. So that's no more. So it's stuff like this that we're doing to really try to root out this problem.
All right, well, Eitan, that's all the time we have. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
No problem. Thank you very much.
And now, on a positive note, Israeli superstar actress Gal Gadot is back in the limelight, and this time she's sharing the screen with co-stars Ryan Reynolds and Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, in what's reportedly set to be the biggest feature film ever made by Netflix. In fact, the action thriller Red Notice, which is set to be released in late 2020, has a production budget alone of roughly $130 million, while some insiders peg the final budget at $200 million. Streaming media giant Netflix only picked up the film from Universal Studios after they passed on the project. Red Notice focuses on the premise of finding the world's most wanted art thief, and it's set to be directed and written by Ross and Marshall Thurber, who directed films such as We're the Millers, Dodgeball, A True Underdog Story, Central Intelligence, and The Skyscraper, several of which also included Dwayne Johnson. And let's not forget that Johnson in turn worked with Gadot in some of the Fast and the Furious films. Anyways, Gadot tweeted and Instagrammed a banner featuring the three co-stars' profile shots earlier this week, writing that she is so excited about this project and that this is going to be so much fun and I can't wait to share this one with you. Well, way to go, Gal. She's a true Wonder Woman, and we can't wait to see the movie.